Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of They Lied About Africa. I'm your host, Numit, and if nobody told you the real story, I will. As many of you know, we're heading towards the end of the FIFA World Cup, and like a lot of people, I've been watching almost every game. The knockout stages have been intense, and the semifinals have been insane, and social media has also been going really crazy, and every match seems to have created some sort of a new conversation, new controversy, and whatnot. But while I was watching, I personally kept noticing something. As more and more African teams were being eliminated towards the beginning, like that group 16, I couldn't help but notice that many of the European teams that were still left in the tournament were filled with players whose families came from Africa or who have some sort of an African heritage. And before anyone misunderstands me, this is not a criticism. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But it did make me stop and ask myself a question. How did Europe come to have so much African football talent? And the moment I asked myself that, I was immediately reminded of a conversation I had a few years ago in one of my French classes at university. We were talking about the 2018 World Cup when France defeated Croatia to become world champions. Shortly after victory, South African comedian Trevor Noah opened an episode of The Daily Show by saying something that instantly went viral. He said Africa won the World Cup. And his point was that although France had won the trophy, many of the players on the team had parents or families from African countries like Cameroon, Mali, Algeria, Guinea, the DRC, Angola, and Senegal. To Trevor Noah, this was something to celebrate. He saw it as a moment to recognize the African heritage of many France's biggest stars. But France did not see it that way. Nah. A few days later, actually, the French ambassador to the United States wrote Noah a public letter. The letter opened with a sentence that immediately grabbed people's attention, and I quote, "I heard your words about an African victory. Nothing could be less true." He then continues to say, "As many of the players have already stated themselves, their parents may have come from another country, but the great majority of them, all but 2 out of 23, were born in France. They were educated in France. They learned to play soccer in France. They are French citizens." He then made what I think was the heart of the argument. He said, "Unlike in the United States of America, France does not refer to its citizens based on their race, religion, or origin. By calling them an African team, it seems you are denying their Frenchness." Trevor Noah responded a few days later. He said he was not denying that players were French. His argument was that they can be both French and proud of their African heritage. He questioned why acknowledging someone's African roots was seen as taking away from their French identity. He also pointed out that many of the players themselves openly celebrated their parents' countries of origin, visited them, spoke about them, and maintained those connections. I remember leaving that class thinking the debate was so fascinating. And at the time, I kept asking myself, who was right? Was Trevor Noah right? Was the French ambassador right? But now, years later, after watching another World Cup unfold, I honestly think everyone has been arguing over the wrong question, because whether those players are French or African or both isn't the question I find most interesting anymore. Nah. It is, how did Europe become home to so much African football talent in the first place? Because once you start following that question, you uncover a story that is not just about football. It's about history, about migration, about economics. It's about a talent pipeline that has shaped European football for decades. So in today's episode, that's exactly what we're going to unpack. So let's actually enter the question I ended the introduction with. How did Europe come to have so much African football talent? Because I think before we can talk about colonialism, scouting networks, billion-dollar clubs, or transfer fees, we have to establish something first. The Trevor Noah debate wasn't really about France. France just happened to be the example that brought this conversation into the spotlight. Once I started paying attention during this World Cup, I realized that what I had noticed on the French team wasn't unique to France at all. It was happening across Europe. As I watched the knockout stage, I kept recognizing player after player with African family roots. At first, I thought maybe I was only noticing it because the Trevor Noah debate was still fresh in my mind, but then I started looking at the squads more closely. England, Belgium, Portugal, one after another, I kept seeing the same pattern. Bukayo Saka was born in London to Nigerian parents. Kobe Meno was born in Stockport to Ghanaian parents. Then there's Belgium. Jeremy Doku was born in Antwerp to Ghanaian parents. And look at Portugal. Rafael Leao was born in Portugal to an Angolan father and a mother from Sao Tome. And those are just a few examples. The point isn't that these players are somehow less European. They are not. Every single one of these players I just mentioned was born in Europe. They grew up there. They came through European football academies. They represent the country they were born in, and they have every right to do so. So if you're listening to this and thinking, well, they're French, or they're English, or they're Belgian, I agree with you. That's not what I'm questioning, though, because I think this is where a lot of conversations online go wrong. people immediately start arguing about identity. Are they African? Are they European? Can they be both? Personally, I don't think that's the most interesting question. The question I'm interested in, it has nothing to do with identity. It's about systems, about understanding why Europe has become home to so much football talent connected to Africa. As I kept researching, I realized I had actually been making another mistake. I was treating all of these players as if they shared the same story. They don't. There are actually two completely different pathways that bring African talent into European football. The first pathway is the one we've mostly been talking about so far, children of African immigrants. These are players whose parents or sometimes grandparents left African countries and settled again in Europe. Their children were born and raised there, joined football clubs at a young age, entered academy systems, and eventually represented the countries they grew up in. That's the story behind many of the players who sparked the Trevor Noah debate. But then there's a second pathway, and this is the one I think receives far less attention. These are players who were actually born and raised in Africa, and they learned the game there. They played for local clubs there. Many of them were identified by European scouts as teenagers or even younger, and eventually made the move to Europe, where they signed professional contracts, developed further, and became household names. Now, these are two completely different journeys, different childhoods, opportunities, immigration stories, and legal pathways. But despite all of those differences, they both lead to the same destination, European football. And that's when I realized this episode wasn't really about France. It wasn't even really about Europe. It was about movement. The movement of talent, opportunity, and eventually the movement of value. Because if generation after generation of football talent connected to Africa continues to flow towards Europe, then we have to ask ourselves why. Is it simply because Europe has the best football infrastructure? Is it because players are freely choosing the best opportunities? Or is there a much bigger story, one shaped by history, economics, migration, and the way global football itself has been built? To answer that, we first need to understand how this pipeline actually works. So how does this actually happen? If you were to ask the average football fan why Europe has so much African talent, they'll probably say something like, well, Europe just has better leagues. And that is true, but I think it skips over almost everything that happens before a player even steps onto the Premier League or Champions League pitch. For many young players across Africa, football is not just a hobby, it's a profession they hope to build from a very young age. Like kids anywhere, they start playing in local neighborhoods, they build school teams, community clubs, and football academies. The difference is that for many of them, the pathway to becoming a professional almost always points in one direction, Europe. And this isn't an accident. Over the past several decades, European clubs have been scouting networks that reach almost every part of the world, including Africa. Clubs do not wait until a player becomes famous. They have scouts, data analysts, partnerships with academies, youth tournaments, and relationships with local coaches whose job is to identify talent long before the rest of the world even knows their names. In many African communities, youth tournaments are attended by scouts representing clubs from England, France, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, Germany, and Italy. Some clubs have formal partnerships with academies on the continent. Others rely on licensed scouts or intermediaries who constantly search for players with professional potential. And this isn't unique to Africa. European clubs scout South America, they scout Asia, they scout North America, but Africa has become one of the world's largest sources of elite football talent because of the combination of an enormous youth population, deep football culture, and the fact that many players can be signed for significantly lower fees than comparable players that are already playing in Europe. Now, if you're wondering, can European clubs just sign a 13-year-old from Ghana or from Senegal or from Nigeria? The answer is generally no. FIFA has rules that prohibit the international transfer of minors with limited exceptions. In most cases, clubs have to wait until a player turns 18 before completing an international transfer, and those rules were created to reduce the exploitation of young players. That doesn't mean clubs wait until a player is 18 to discover them, though. It's actually quite the opposite. Many players are identified before they're eligible to move. Clubs monitor their progress and they invite them to train and maintain relationships with agents and academies and position themselves to sign them as soon as the rules allow. So by the time many African players arrive in Europe, they've often been on a club's radar for years, and once they arrive, they're entering some of the most advanced football systems in the world. World-class coaching, sports scientists, nutritionists, medical staff, performance analysis, training facilities, competitive youth leagues, resources that many clubs in Africa simply cannot afford. This is an important point because I don't want to create the impression that European clubs simply find talented players and do nothing else. They invest heavily in developing them. The investment is real. The question isn't whether European clubs clubs add value. They absolutely do. The question is why those resources are concentrated in Europe instead of being distributed more evenly across the football world. Because imagine if that same level of investment existed across African domestic leagues. How many players would stay longer? How many clubs would become financially stronger? How many leagues would become globally competitive? Those are the questions we should be asking. And once I started looking into why the resources are concentrated in Europe, I realized that football alone could not explain it. To understand that, we have to go back much further than FIFA. We have to go back to colonialism. Now, before we go any further, I want to address something that some of you might be thinking. Isn't this just globalization? After all, talented people move all over the world. Engineers move, doctors, musicians. So why should football be any different? And that's a fair question. The answer is that football isn't just different because people move. It's different because where they move and why they move didn't happen randomly. Let's take France as an example. France didn't suddenly wake up one day with millions of citizens whose families come from Senegal, Mali, Algeria, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, or the DRC. Those migration patterns were shaped over more than a century of French colonial rule. At its height, the French colonial empire controlled large parts of West and Central Africa. France governed those territories, extracted resources, recruited soldiers, built administrative systems, imposed the French language, and created political and economic relationships that continued long after many of these countries gained independence. When people from former colonies later migrated to France for work, education, military service, or to reunite with family, they weren't moving to a completely unfamiliar country. Many already spoke French. Many had been educated in French systems. Many had legal pathways that people from other parts of the world did not have. Over time, communities formed. Their children were born in France. Those children entered local football clubs just like everybody else. Some eventually became professional footballers. The same pattern exists elsewhere. Portugal has long-standing ties to Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and Sao Tome. Belgium's relationship with the DRC is one of the most well-known, and brutal by the way, examples of European colonialism in Africa. England's immigration patterns were shaped by the British Empire and later by post-war migration. So when we see players of African heritage representing these countries today, that isn't an accident. It's part of a much longer historical story. Now, I want to be careful here because this is where people sometimes oversimplify things. I'm not saying European national teams are successful because they once had colonies. That would be far too simplistic. European countries still had to build exceptional football academies. They invested in coaching. They built world-class leagues. They created some of the best player development systems on the planet. Those achievements are very much real, but it's also true that colonial history influenced who had access to those systems. Without those migration patterns, the talent pool available to many European countries would look very different today, and that's not a speculation. That's simply how demographics work. But there's another side to the story that we have not talked about yet. Everything we've discussed so far has focused on players whose families migrated to Europe. What about the players who never migrated as children? The players who were born, raised, and developed in Africa before being recruited by European clubs. Because if Africa is producing so much elite football talent, why do so many of its biggest stars end up leaving the continent before ever reaching their peak? And that's where the economics of football begin to tell a very different story. So why don't more of Africa's best players stay? It's a question I've seen a lot online. If Africa produces so much football talent, why aren't the strongest leagues in Africa? Why aren't the biggest clubs in Africa? Why does it seem like every young player dreams of playing in England, Spain, Germany, Italy, or France? The short answer is money. But that doesn't really explain anything. The better question is why so much of football's money is concentrated in Europe. Take the Premier League as an example. It's the wealthiest football league in the world. It earns billions of dollars every year through television rights, sponsorships, commercial partnerships, ticket sales, merchandising, and international broadcasting deals. The same is true, although to different degrees, for leagues like the La Liga, Serie A, and the League One. That money changes everything. It allows clubs to build state-of-the-art training facilities. It allows them to hire world-class coaches, nutritionists, sports psychologists, data analysts, medical teams, and scouting departments. It allows them to sign players for tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. It allows them to pay salaries that most clubs around the world simply cannot compete with. Now, compare that to many domestic leagues across Africa. That doesn't mean there isn't talent. There absolutely is. What many leagues lack is the same level of financial investment. Broadcasting deals are much smaller. Corporate sponsorship is often more limited. Infrastructure varies significantly from country to country. Some clubs struggle with reliable training facilities, consistent funding, or even paying players on time. So imagine you're an 18-year-old footballer in Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, or Cameroon. A European club offers you better coaching facilities and a higher salary. The opportunity to compete against some of the best players in the world and the possibility of completely changing your family's financial future. For almost anyone, that's an easy decision. And I think it's important to say that because sometimes these conversations become unfair to the players. People will say things like, oh, they're abandoning Africa. And I personally don't see it that way. For many players, choosing Europe isn't rejecting Africa. It's taking advantage of the biggest opportunity available to them. Most of us would probably make the same choice. So this isn't really about blaming individual players. It's about asking why the system is set up so that Europe consistently becomes a destination. Because here's something I found really interesting. African clubs often become stepping stones rather than final destinations. A young player can develop at a local academy and then they sign for a domestic club, and then they have 1 or 2 strong seasons. They get transferred to Europe. The selling club receives a transfer fee, which can be incredibly important financially. But from that point on, the biggest economic value created by that player's career is usually generated somewhere else. The television revenues, the sponsorship deals, the shirt sales, the Champions League prize money, the global media attention, the commercial partnerships. Those benefits largely stay with the European clubs and leagues where the player spends the rest of his career. And this isn't unique to one player. It's the business model of modern football. European clubs invest because they expect a return. Sometimes that return comes through winning trophies. Sometimes it comes through developing a player and selling him for a much higher transfer fee a few years later. Sometimes it comes through both. That's why scouting has become one of the most important investments a club can make. Finding the next superstar before anyone else does can generate enormous financial returns. And Africa has become one of the places where many clubs believe those future stars can be found. Now, none of this means African football does not benefit. Transfer fees can help clubs survive. Players often send money back home in the form of remittances, and they invest in their communities, and they build schools, and they build hospitals and academies, and they inspire the next generation. And those are real benefits. But it does raise a bigger question, because if Africa is producing so much of the world's football talent, what would African football look like if more of the investment, infrastructure, broadcasting revenue, and commercial opportunities existed on the continent itself? Because at this point, we're no longer talking about football, we're talking about development. Now, after spending all this time researching for this episode, I also realized something else. This conversation can very easily become unfair if we are not careful. Whenever we talk about African football in Europe, the discussion usually ends up in one of two extremes. Either people argue that Europe is simply taking advantage of Africa, or they argue that Europe has earned everything because it built the best football system. I don't think either explanation tells the full story, but the reality is that European football has become the global standard for a reason. The quality of coaching is exceptional. The youth development is highly organized. The infrastructure is incredible. The competition is relentless. When the best players in the world compete against each other every single week, they continue pushing each other to improve. And African players don't become world class simply because they arrive in Europe. They still have to earn their place. Every week they're competing against hundreds of other professionals fighting for the exact same position. Many don't make it, so giving European clubs credit for developing players is not controversial. They deserve the credit. At the same time, we shouldn't pretend they developed those players from nothing. No academy can manufacture ability. No coach can invent speed, vision, intelligence, creativity, or instinct. Those qualities already existed before many of these players even arrived in Europe. What Europe often does exceptionally well is identify that talent, refine it, invest in it, and provide an environment where it can reach its highest level. That's an important distinction because it changes that conversation. The debate isn't about whether Europe develops talent. It clearly does. The debate is about where the greatest return on that development ends up. Think about almost any major industry. The place that captures the highest value part of the supply chain usually becomes the wealthiest. In technology, it's often the companies designing the products that rather than extracting the raw materials. In fashion, it's often the brands rather than the countries growing the cotton. Football isn't identical to those industries, but there is a similar idea at work. The continent supplying much of the talent is not necessarily the continent capturing most of the long-term financial value created by that talent. Recognizing that does not diminish what European football has accomplished. It simply gives us a more complete picture of how the global game actually functions. And I think that's exactly what this podcast is supposed to do. Not replace one oversimplified story with another, but take something we all think we understand, look at it more closely, and leave with a more complete understanding than what we had before. Now, like I mentioned earlier, when I first started researching this episode, I thought I was making an episode about football, and I clearly was not. I ended up learning about migration, colonial history, economics, demographics, and how value moves around the world. Football just happened to be the lens that made all those things easier to see, and I think that's the biggest lesson I hope you take away from today's episode. This wasn't really about whether Trevor Noah was right or whether the French ambassador was right. It wasn't about deciding whether certain players were African enough or European enough. It was about understanding the system, because when you understand the system, you start noticing the same patterns in places far beyond football. The world has been paying attention to Africa for a long time. European football clubs have spent decades investing millions of dollars scouting African talent because they believe the continent produces exceptional athletes. At the same time, global investors, multinational companies, and development banks are increasing their investments across Africa because they see long-term economic potential. Africa is home to many of the world's fastest growing economies. And by 2050, 1 in 4 people on Earth is expected to be an African. That means one of the world's largest workforces in consumer markets will be on the continent. Now, does that mean Africa doesn't have challenges? Of course not. Every country has its own political, economic, and social realities, and those realities deserve to be discussed honestly. But I also think it's a mistake to ignore where the rest of the world is choosing to invest its attention. And that's why I started They Lied About Africa. Not because I want to convince you that Africa is perfect, not because I think everyone in the diaspora should move back tomorrow, and not because I want you to blindly believe everything you hear online, including from me. I started this podcast because I believe that before we can invest in Africa, build in Africa, work in Africa, or even reconnect with Africa, we owe it to ourselves to understand it, to ask better questions, challenge assumptions, and to look beyond headlines and stereotypes. And most importantly, to make decisions based on evidence instead of fear. If this episode made you think differently or taught you something you didn't know before, I'd really appreciate it if you shared it with a friend, a family member, or someone who loves football. And that's how this podcast grows, and it's how we get more people having these conversations. If you have a topic you'd like me to cover or someone you think that I should interview, send me a message. I read your suggestions, and many of them become future episodes. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Until next time, I'm Numpit, and if nobody told you the real story, I will.